long time ago, on a YouTube far, far away, I released a video about Star Wars. It's kind of a meandering piece that looks at the full history of the Star Wars franchise and video games up to that point, and I don't know if I'd really recommend watching it, but in the end I said something I've been thinking about lately.
The date of when my Star Wars ended is more nebulous, but I can tell you this. It happened not when they stopped making Star Wars games, but when they stopped exploring Star Wars with games.
And to be honest, I was making what we might now call a super ludocentric argument, that the only way to do anything with the Star Wars property was to adapt its universe mechanically, through game systems. And, oh, sweet summer child, no. That poor baby game critic. But what's really got me thinking about that line is the idea of Star Wars quote-unquote ending. It seems a bit naive now, but it was, let's say, a transitional time for the Star Wars property. The Disney acquisition of Lucasfilm was just a year prior. LucasArts had been shuttered a few months earlier because Disney notoriously does not know how to do in-house interactive entertainment, RIP Disney Interactive. EA had just acquired the exclusive console video game rights to the property with some caveats in the form of LEGO and Disney Infinity games, and there was a new trilogy of movies on the horizon, and no one really knew what the future held. The future of Star Wars at that point was a big question mark. And now the future is here. We have not just a new trilogy of movies under our belts, but 2 side story films as well. There's a Star Wars theme park land on both coasts of the United States, a canon Star Wars television show is now the headline for Disney's new streaming service, and Baby Yoda memes have conquered the planet. So I thought it would be a good time to look back at what has happened in the world of Star Wars video games since that last video. And it turns out the answer is not very much. In the time EA has held onto the property since 2013, we've seen continued support for the Old Republic in the form of expansions, which as I understand it have been pretty well received, but MMOs are totally not my wheelhouse and I don't really have anything to say about them. But more relevant to the focus of this video, EA have released a grand total of 3 major new titles in the last 6.5 years. 2 of those titles are in the Battlefront franchise, an attempt to revive a 2004 Star Wars title created by Pandemic, who were then acquired by EA in 2008 and shuttered by EA in 2009, so EA gonna EA, but whatever. The Battlefront games are multiplayer-focused shooters in the vein of a Battlefield title, large in scale with both vehicle and on-foot combat, so it makes sense that EA handed the reins to DICE, the developers of Battlefield, to develop the games. And the first EA Battlefront is kind of forgettable, all things considered. It's Battlefield with a lot of the depth and complexity sanded off in an attempt to get it to easily appeal to both kids and a mass-market Star Wars audience. So none of Battlefield's tactically destructible walls, no worrying about bullet drop-off over long distances, you can only hold a single weapon at a time and everything else is a cooldown-based ability, hero characters and vehicles or power-ups you just find on the field and walk over to activate, that sort of thing. It's got a low skill floor, which makes it very accessible, but it also has a really low skill ceiling, which makes it kind of boring to play. What Battlefront 2015 really managed to achieve is to inspire the imaginations of people pining for a new single-player Star Wars game. It was the first major title set during the films to be released since 2010's Force Unleashed 2, which wasn't all that interested in taking cues from the movies. Force Unleashed 2 was all massive video game hallways and empty corridors for God of War-style combat, often in the sterile environments of the prequel trilogy. In contrast, DICE set Battlefront primarily in the outdoors during the original trilogy and took care to reproduce the costuming and environments of the films. Popularizing the idea of a gritty, functional, lived-in sci-fi world is one of the many things Star Wars is kind of known for, and DICE captured that sensibility and the chunky scrap metal and plastic bits prop look that made it possible with a level of fidelity we simply hadn't seen in a Star Wars video game before. Where something like Alien Isolation leaned into the plasticky 70s look of its franchise intentionally, here it's a byproduct of the way the film props were produced, and the result is something that has this distinct fantasy tech by way of 70s aesthetics vibe. It didn't look at all the way you design a lived-in sci-fi world in 2015, but it did look undeniably Star Wars. But since all you do in Battlefront is run around and blast people in a simple shooter, the hyper-detailed and lovingly recreated environments felt a bit wasted. I remember thinking to myself, imagine a Star Wars game that looked like this, but that invited you into its world instead of using it as a set dressing. The game's sequel, Battlefront 2, attempted to deliver on a bit of that promise. Unlike the first Battlefront, the game made a pass at a single-player campaign, and the results were probably better than it should have been. It's not all that uncommon for multiplayer-focused titles to skip on single-player campaigns entirely, so to get one with an original story featuring original characters this fully featured is impressive. It's got stealthy sections, big shootout sections, dogfighting bits, and parts where you play as the heroes from the film. And those components are woven together to tell a story that broaches some cool ideas, even if they're a little underexplored.
Look alive, agents. We can grieve later. Right now, we need to move.
The idea of following a stormtrooper in the wake of the second Death Star's destruction has potential. A soldier fighting a war that is effectively lost, watching the empire she fought for and thought was infallible crumble, and having to find a new identity in the rubble.
Just want to know what's next.
We have to warn people.
Who? The rebels? They're just gonna toss us in Sunspot Prison before we can even say a word.
Unfortunately, it doesn't do much with that setup, really, because it gives protagonist Iden Versio a bunch of personal stakes to make it less abstract. The Empire is now evil to her because it attacked her homeworld, and her dad made the call to do it, so it's less about recovering from fashy tendencies or rebuilding your life after it falls apart, and more just a Star Wars, my dad is part of the evil Empire and I have to confront him story. Which I guess is more fitting for the franchise overall, but it's far less interesting, at least to me. Still, an original story with original characters is a bold choice for a game that's otherwise dedicated to just running through a best-of list of Star Wars scenarios. And that best-of list seems to be the raison d'etre for Battlefront 2. It almost feels like the Smash Brothers of Star Wars, acting as a mini museum of characters and locations from all three trilogies, and some of the side story movies. From Clone Troopers to the First Order, from Naboo to Crate, from Anakin to Adam Driver, it's all here. Except for the likeness rights to Harrison Ford, I guess. But you can just play as Alden Ehrenreich instead, so...
I'm out of it for a little while. Everyone gets delusions of grandeur.
Regardless, it's fine, and it's doing more or less exactly what The Force Unleashed did years before it. It's taking an established game genre and putting a layer of Star Wars paint over it. It is perhaps the most obvious, least interesting thing you could do with the Star Wars license, a war game powered by a hodgepodge of nostalgic iconography, but it does that very well. And that just leaves the latest game of the three mainline console games EA has produced during its exclusivity deal with Disney, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. After the cancellation of LucasArts 1313 and EA's Ragtag, we now finally have the first narrative-focused single-player Star Wars title in almost a decade. You play as Cal Kestis, a Jedi Padawan who escapes from the Empire during Order 66 and goes into hiding on Bracca, a world built entirely around ship salvaging. Years later, there's an accident that requires Cal to use his Force powers to save a friend, and that puts him on the radar of the Inquisitors, a band of Dark Force users under the command of Darth Vader whose goal is to eliminate any Jedi that survived Order 66. Luckily, Cal is saved by Seer Junda, a former Jedi who cut herself off from the Force, and Grease Dritus, a gruff but lovable freelance pilot with a gambling issue. Together they set off on a mission to recover a MacGuffin that will let them restore the Jedi Order. And the most interesting thing about Jedi Fallen Order to me is how it kind of does to video games, at least a bit, what Star Wars did to film. Star Wars, the original 1977 film, was constructed out of a variety of parts from other movies that George Lucas was able to combine into something that was at once utterly derivative, but also very much its own thing. Star Wars was born out of Akira Kurosawa films, Flash Gordon serials, pulpy action-adventure shorts, and general myth and legend. Kyle Calgren actually has a beautiful video on this called Star Wars minus Star Wars, which cuts together the story for A New Hope using only footage of things that were either inspirational to Star Wars or things that were subsequently inspired by Star Wars. It's great and you should check it out. But my point is that Star Wars stuck out in people's minds in part because it kind of hot glued all these influences together into a single ball of something new. And that's what Jedi Fallen Order tries to do, except instead of narrative beats, cinematography, and aesthetic values from various films, it's mechanic and level design from other games. The opening of the game, for example, is the most outrageously video gamey that Fallen Order gets. It's an escape sequence off of a moving train that is straight out of Uncharted, with platforms crumbling as you climb them and people shooting at you all at a ridiculous speed and dizzying heights.
He shot the coupling out. Gotta get down! Ah! Ah! No, no, no!
Its main platforming mechanics and emphasis on puzzle solving, however, feel straight out of the 3D Prince of Persia games. Rigid wall running and time jumps that are more about reading the next step as it comes at you than the expressive movement of, say, a Mario game. And the puzzles tend to be these chamber-sized riddles about pushing balls around or using the Force to make a platform appear for you. They're not story-based lore puzzles or BioWare-style Towers of Hanoi time wasters. They're very much about being able to build the environment in which you can platform.
You sure you want to plug into this thing? Okay. Oh, shortcut. That's why you wanted to move this thing. You had no idea that was there, did you? You just wanted to turn that cutter on.
Meanwhile, its core combat and boss fights, along with its health system, all harken to Dark Souls or Bloodborne. Health is a precious resource that can only be fully restored at a place to rest and level up at the expense of respawning all enemies, and combat is all about using iframes and parries to expose weaknesses before striking. There are bosses that have more complicated movesets that require you to learn how to handle them, and even optional bosses for bonus experience. The level design, though, is distinctly Metroidvania rather than Souls-like. A series of crisscrossing caverns with barriers you can't traverse until you have a specific power, and an encouragement to come back to areas you've been to before and see what's behind those doors once you have that ability unlocked. There's a ship you regularly return to as both a safe haven and a place to talk to the crew before deciding where you want to go next that feels very Mass Effect inspired. Heck, there's a bit that almost certainly seems inspired by Shadow of the Colossus when you're climbing a moss-covered AT-AT before breaking inside of it to play a turret sequence that's basically taken from mid-2000s World War II games, and I haven't seen one of those since, like, Spec Ops: The Line, which itself was sort of commenting on the trope. And even though I hate boring turret sections, it works here because of the property. You're driving an AT-AT that you just hijacked. And before people complain, yes, there's a similar scene in Battlefront 2, but it isn't half as memorable if I'm being completely honest, in part because of its clunky interface, but also because you sort of just walk into it. It isn't a Shadow of the Colossus beast that you scale and then break your way into. It's a level in a game that has a World War II shooter sensibility, giving you a World War II shooter turret section, and it just doesn't work as well as it does in Jedi Fallen Order. So there is undeniably something that works about this collage of ideas approach. And it's fascinating to see a Star Wars game do to video games what Star Wars the movie did to film and legend 40 years ago. I'm not sure it works as well as Star Wars itself did. A New Hope went on to become one of the most influential films of all time as a result of its melting pot of influences, but Jedi Fallen Order feels more like a mosaic, with each component standing on its own, but not really forming a fundamentally new, cohesive whole. If they do congeal into anything coherent, it seems to be a way to take the Souls-like template and make an easier and more accessible Western-style big-budget narrative title out of it. But on the whole, I think it's one of the more interesting takes I've seen on adapting the material, because you're not just adapting blasters and the Force and droids, but instead you're adapting the process by which A New Hope was made. It takes a lot to get me to go, oh hey, interesting take on Star Wars, but this game managed to get me to do it. The game also has a somewhat interesting relationship to Star Wars iconography. Like, Star Wars in general, and Disney-era Star Wars in particular, has an ongoing problem with this. Elements of the franchise are incredibly well-known and loaded with nostalgia and meaning, and that leads to problems. There is, if the history of Star Wars media is any indication, an incredible temptation to tie whatever you're making, be it a book, a game, a movie, whatever, to the legendarily beloved characters, vehicles, aesthetic flourishes, musical cues, or locations from the films, to give whatever you're making a bit of prestige or legitimacy by association.
This is too easy. Now to get to my ship.
I mean, go back and play older Star Wars games and tell me how often you accidentally bump into the Millennium Falcon or Lando or C-3PO or end up in Mos Eisley's cantina.
I think that was Luke Skywalker. I can't believe it.
Well, I'll be the Millennium Falcon. Han, Chewie, anybody here?
You must be Chewbacca. Why are you here? Leia Organa? Wow, must be important business.
Additionally, iconography is saleable. Baby Yoda is blowing up the world not just because cute puppet baby, but because cute puppet baby Yoda. And Disney knows this. That's why one of the main draws of Galaxy's Edge is to see the Millennium Falcon in person. This obsession with the minutiae and iconography of a late 70s, early 80s franchise used to be more of a problem in the video game and extended universe novels. As I pointed out in the previous Star Wars video, the title crawl was included in just about every video game imaginable because it wasn't Star Wars if you didn't have it. So much so that Star Wars Episode 1 Racer opened with this epic music and several paragraphs explaining the backstory of A racing game. But now even the mainline films can't escape this need to tie themselves to the original trilogy in unnecessary ways and explore and recontextualize and remix established iconography rather than telling their own damn stories. Solo exists basically to explain how Han got his name, blaster, Wookiee companion, friendship with Lando, the Millennium Falcon, and a general standoffish rogue with a heart of gold sensibility, then seals him away like an action figure mint in box until A New Hope starts, because it's all about explaining iconography you already know rather than letting this character and his film arrive at a narrative naturally. And the current mainline trilogy is obsessed with the past and with legacy, with The Force Awakens desperate to recapture the magic of A New Hope by basically just retreading its plot, The Last Jedi commenting on the burden of the past and the need to move on to something new, and Rise of Skywalker saying screw it and straight up resurrecting the past to relive old conflicts with old villains. Star Wars, the film franchise, feels kind of like an Ouroboros at this point. It's a series that's just eating itself with no idea where to go next or how to tell stories without recycling episodes 4 through 6. Again. Which is why it was so refreshing that Jedi Fallen Order doesn't do almost anything from the original trilogy of films. There's no Millennium Falcon, there's no Death Star, there's no Mos Eisley Cantina scene or Jizz music, there's no cameos from R2-D2 or Boba Fett or Jabba the Hutt. Some of that's just necessity, this does take place before A New Hope, but the restraint feels intentional. The bits the game does take from the films are used to drive the plot more than anything. Palpatine declares Order 66, and we have to see that play out to make sense of the scene that's happening. And we get Obi-Wan's message to the Jedi not to return to the temple on Coruscant, basically as an example of how holocrons work, that isn't treated with reverence, but as this sort of like leftover voicemail that Seer just happened to have on hand.
A holocron. It stores information, but only accessible to Jedi. Hang on, I think I have one around here.
This is Master Obi-Wan Kenobi. I regret to report that both our Jedi Order and the Republic have fallen.
It avoids dropping the John Williams score except where it absolutely needs to, and the restraint makes the moment it does use it far more powerful.
By the will of the Force, Cal Kestis. Rise, Jedi Knight. You are ready.
And, much to my pleasure, it doesn't even have a Star Wars title crawl. It starts with a sweeping shot of Bracca's junkyards, with Cal's alien rock and roll blasting in his ears, and it almost feels more like a scene from 1981's Heavy Metal than from Star Wars, and I love that. And as someone who is just sick to death of Star Wars being about its own iconography and its own legacy to the point where we're suffocating anything new, it was just really nice to see a game that attempts to tell a story without most of that baggage. Except for the Darth Vader boss fight at the end. And hey, that's not a spoiler, they put that in the commercials. And yes, that bit does feel a bit gratuitous, especially since they avoid doing the obnoxious reference thing so studiously everywhere else, and all the emotional stakes at the end are with Seer's fallen Padawan Trilla, who we follow the whole game, not a random space wizard in black who only has meaning because we've all seen the movies. The Vader bit aside, what Jedi Fallen Order does, instead of saying, "Look, the Millennium Falcon! This is so Star Wars!" is to pull bits of lore, primarily from the Clone Wars television show, and try to build a narrative with new characters around that. Marin's whole conflict, for example, is built on dealing with the trauma of watching almost all of her fellow Night Sisters killed, which is a big arc in Season 4 of the Clone Wars. The cameos you get on Kashyyyk are focused on Clone Wars-era heroes, Tarful and Saw Gerrera, and even the MacGuffin driving the plot of the game, a holocron containing the identities of Force-sensitive children throughout the galaxy, is an object taken more or less verbatim from the Clone Wars.
Padawan Ahsoka boarded the warship of cunning bounty hunter Cad Bane to recover a stolen holocron containing a list of the galaxy's Force-sensitive children and future Jedi Knights.
I have placed inside this vault a Jedi holocron containing a list of the names and locations of young Force sensitives throughout the galaxy.
And to be clear, there's still Star Wars iconography. Stormtroopers, R2 droids, hyperspace jumps, lightsabers, Rodians. But it's not a story about that iconography. It's not the continuing adventures of the Millennium Falcon cameos. It's the story of how Cal, Cere, Grease, Marin, and BD-1 come together to overcome their collective past traumas and mistakes and build a future. If Battlefront 2's focus is nothing but iconography, a big, fun toy box full of everyone's favorite Star Wars stuff that we can just mash together because it's fun,
Get them, Han Solo!
then Jedi Fallen Order feels a bit like an attempt to really move on from that. And in that sense, it represents a really exciting turn for these games for me, because I disagree with my old video at this point. I don't want to see Star Wars explored with games anymore. We've done it. It's done. There are other things to make games about than Star Wars, especially Star Wars minutia, which is well overrepresented as it is. But if there have to be new Star Wars games, and both Disney and EA seem to insist that there do, I'd much rather have new stories and new adventures with new characters and new places than witness the Millennium Falcon show up on yet another warmed-over retread of adventures where we bump into Rey or Lando or Luke and help save the day. And honestly, at this point, that goes double for the films.